At 1:23:40 in the morning, the shutdown button was pressed. Inside Chernobyl Reactor 4. Seconds later, the reactor exploded. For years, the simplest version of the story blamed reckless operators. And one man above all, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. But in a detailed 1994 interview, Dyatlov argued that the button intended to stop. The reactor had triggered a design defect hidden from the people using it. This film follows his account as its narrative spine. It does not treat every claim as settled fact. Where Dyatlov's interpretation differs from later evidence, that difference will be clear. What matters is that the International Atomic Energy Agency's later reassessment supported a large part of his central case. Chernobyl was not merely a story of bad operators. It was a failure designed into a machine, its rules, and the system around it. Chernobyl began as a symbol of Soviet modernity. The power station stood roughly 110 kilometers north of Kiev. 3 kilometers away, Pripyat was built for its workers, a young city of schools, apartments, sports halls, and tree-lined avenues. By 1986 it had about 49,000 residents. Reactor 4 entered service in 1983. Like the station's other units, it was an RBMK 1000, a huge, graphite-moderated, water-cooled reactor able to produce 1,000 megawatts of electricity. It could be refueled while running and was economical to build at Soviet scale. But the design also combined characteristics that could become dangerous. It had no Western-style full-pressure containment building. More importantly, under certain conditions, boiling water could increase rather than reduce the nuclear reaction. The plant looked permanent. The physics inside it was less forgiving. To understand the accident, picture thousands of vertical channels passing through a 12-meter wide stack of graphite blocks. Fuel sat inside those channels. Pressurized water flowed upward, removed heat, boiled, and sent steam directly to the turbines. Water did two jobs. It cooled the fuel, but it also absorbed some neutrons. Graphite slowed neutrons and helped the chain reaction continue. When more water turned into steam bubbles, or voids, less water remained to absorb neutrons. In the accident configuration, reactivity rose. More power made more steam could make more power. This is the positive void coefficient. Control rods were supposed to stop that reaction. Their neutron-absorbing sections descended from above. But each rod also carried a graphite displacer. When a fully withdrawn rod first moved down, graphite entered the lower core and displaced neutron-absorbing water before the absorber arrived. For a few seconds, a shutdown command could add reactivity in part of the core. Dyatlov's 1994 argument begins with this paradox. Reactor 4 was due to shut down for maintenance. Before that happened, the crew would repeat an electrical safety test. If outside power failed, the turbines would keep spinning for a short time. Engineers wanted to know whether that remaining momentum could power essential pumps until emergency diesel generators took over. The idea was not absurd, and earlier attempts had produced unsatisfactory results. The test concerned the turbine generator, not nuclear physics. Yet it had not been developed and reviewed as a fully integrated reactor safety procedure. Power fell to about half during the day. Then the regional grid dispatcher asked the plant to hold production because another station was unavailable. The shutdown paused for hours. Permission to continue came at around 11 at night. The day shift that prepared the test had gone home. A night crew inherited a delayed experiment and a reactor changing internally as Xenon accumulated. Just after midnight, during a change in the automatic control system, reactor power collapsed from roughly 500 megawatts thermal to around 30. Xenon 135, a powerful neutron absorber produced inside. The fuel now made recovery difficult. Operators withdrew many control rods and stabilized the reactor at about 200 megawatts thermal, far below the level originally expected. For the test, Later calculations placed the operating reactivity margin near 7 or 8 equivalent rods, below the required minimum of 15. Dyatlov disputed that calculation. He argued that the plant computer did not properly account for partly inserted automatic rods, that the margin could not be measured quickly in a changing reactor, and that low power operation itself was not forbidden by the rules then in force. Even if his numerical defense is rejected, his broader point matters. Operators were not told that a low reactivity margin could turn the shutdown system into a trigger. They were watching a reactor with poor instrumentation and incomplete safety information. Popular retellings often say the crew disabled every safety system. That is not accurate. Some automatic protections were blocked so the turbine test would not end prematurely. The emergency core cooling system had also been isolated under the approved program. These decisions reflected weak safety culture and a poorly designed test. But the later reassessment found that disconnecting emergency core cooling did not initiate the explosion and could not have stopped an event that destroyed the reactor channels almost immediately. Dyatlov was categorical. At 1:03, with the reactor holding at 200 megawatts, the displayed parameters were stable and there were no emergency signals. He rejected the picture of a panicked control room, knowingly pushing a reactor toward destruction. The fair conclusion is narrower. The crew had created an unsafe state, partly through ill-judged actions. But the rules, instruments, and training did not reveal just how unsafe it was. A safe design should turn serious mistakes into a shutdown, not an explosion. At 1:23 and 4 seconds, steam to turbine number 8 was cut and the rundown test began. As the turbine slowed, for connected pump slowed with it, water flow declined and steam formation increased. The reactor's automatic controller initially held power near 200 megawatts. 36 seconds later, the AZ5 shutdown button was pressed. The exact reason remains uncertain. It may simply have marked the planned end of the test. Dyatlov recalled seeing shift foreman Alexander A.H. Kemov gesture to the reactor operator to press it, with no sign of alarm. The rods began their slow descent. Most had been pulled far out. In the lower core, graphite displacers entered water-filled sections first. Instead of immediately absorbing neutrons, they briefly added positive reactivity. A local power spike formed where the reactor was least able to tolerate it. At 1:23 and 43 seconds, high-power alarms arrived. The command designed to end the reaction had helped begin the runaway. Power rose with extraordinary speed. Fuel channels ruptured. Water flashed into steam and pressure lifted the reactor's enormous upper structure, tearing apart more channels and jamming the descending rods. A second explosion followed within seconds. Its exact chemistry remains debated, but this was not a nuclear bomb. It was a catastrophic reactor. Power excursion followed by destructive steam and chemical forces. The building opened to the night. Burning material and fragments of fuel and graphite landed across surrounding roofs. 2 plant workers died from the initial explosions and trauma. Inside the control room, the scale of destruction was almost impossible to accept. Instruments were failing and the reactor itself could not be seen from the panels. Staff attempted to restore cooling to a core that no longer existed as an intact system. Firefighters arrived without a clear understanding of the radiation field. By stopping roof fires from spreading to Unit 3, they helped prevent an even larger industrial disaster. Many paid for that work with lethal doses. PIPAT continued through most of Saturday with almost no public warning. Radiation had no color or smell. Children played outside while buses were quietly assembled from across the region. Evacuation began on Sunday afternoon, about 36 hours after the explosion. Residents were told to carry documents, a little food and clothing, and to expect a temporary absence. Most never returned to live in their homes. Radioactive material traveled across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and much of Europe. On Monday, Instruments at Sweden's Forsmark nuclear station detected contamination arriving from elsewhere. Only then did Moscow issue a brief public acknowledgement. By the end of 1986, about 116,000 people had been evacuated from Pripyat and other settlements. The most important public exposures came from iodine-131 and cesium-137, one short-lived, and concentrated in the thyroid, the other persistent in land and food. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, engineers, miners, pilots, medical staff and civilian workers became known as liquidators. Helicopters dropped materials into the ruin. Crews drained water, cleared debris, buried contaminated soil and built an enormous concrete and steel shelter around Unit 4. Robots failed in radiation fields, so some of the most dangerous rooftop work was done by people in brief, timed runs. Their equipment was often improvised. Their service was real, even when later mythology simplified what each operation achieved. Among 134 emergency workers diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome, 28 died in 1986. The clearest long-term radiation effect in the broader population was a large increase in thyroid cancer among those exposed as children or adolescents, especially where contaminated milk delivered radioactive iodine. Any single grand total for Chernobyl deaths hides uncertainty. Direct deaths, observed cancers, and modeled future risk are different categories. A responsible history says which number it is using. In 1987, plant director Viktor Brukhachnov, chief engineer Nikolai Foh Minute, and Anatoly Dyatlov were sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. The prosecution focused on violations by plant management and operators. Reactor design information remained restricted. Dyatlov had received a severe radiation dose and was already in poor health. He served roughly 4 years before release. In a 1991 article, a memoir, and his 1994 recorded interview, he built a technical defense. He said the test was neither bizarre nor decisive. He said low power operation had not been prohibited. He said emergency core cooling was irrelevant to the explosion. Above all, he argued that operators were never told the control rods could make a Z5 briefly add reactivity. Dyatlov's account is self-defense from a convicted participant, not a neutral verdict. But dismissing it for that reason would miss the documents, calculations, and later findings that made his argument historically important. The international story changed before Dyatlov's final interview. In 1992, the IAEA published INSAG 7, updating the report it had issued after the Soviet presentation in 1986. The new assessment shifted emphasis toward the reactor's physical characteristics, the design of its control rods and safety systems, and the failure to communicate important safety information. It recognized that the positive shutdown effect was known from an earlier RBMK event, but had not been properly eliminated or explained to operators. That is powerful support for Dyatlov's central thesis. It is not complete. Exoneration. INSAG still described critical operator actions as severely ill-judged and treated human factors as a major element. The crew brought the reactor into a state outside the safe envelope, whether or not that envelope had been clearly defined. The strongest conclusion is therefore systemic. Designers accepted an unstable reactor. Institutions withheld or diluted hazard information. Plant procedures normalized risk. Operators made consequential decisions. Inside that system, Chernobyl required every layer to fail. Chernobyl changed nuclear safety far beyond the Soviet Union. Remaining RBMK reactors were modified, control rods were redesigned, shut down. Speed improved, and the dangerous void response reduced. International cooperation and the modern language of safety culture grew from the recognition that hardware, institutions, and human behavior cannot be separated. The first shelter was built in only months. Decades later, the new safe confinement was moved over Reactor 4, creating space for a much longer dismantling task. The exclusion zone remains both a contaminated landscape and the lost home of communities displaced by policy and physics. Anatoly Dyatlov died in 1995. Believing his account does not require believing that every choice in the control room was correct. His most important claim was larger: a reactor must remain safe when people are tired, confused, imperfect, or wrong. If pressing the shutdown button can destroy the machine, the final error was not simply the hand that pressed it. It was the system that made that outcome possible, and then told the world to blame the hand.